Yes.
So I think we can start. Participant number थोड़ा low है, but hopefully और लोग आ
चलेगा
जाएंगे.
जी. Hmm.
हाँ, ठीक. So a very good morning to all. My name is Adityan, and I'm a teaching faculty at the Periyar School of Architecture, New Delhi. I welcome you all to the 38th webinar in the Every Friday webinar series. Today, we will be discussing the value of modern built heritage led by architect Adityan Bharati. Adityan is an architect and urbanist presently based out of Helsinki, Finland, with a background in heritage conservation and project management. Having worked for over 3 years with renowned conservation architect Abha Narayan Lamba. During his tenure, he has been the project architect behind the conservation of well-known heritage buildings such as the Crawford Market in Mumbai and the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Corbusier's Capital Complex in Chandigarh. He proceeded to do a double master's in construction and real estate management from Finland and Germany. Presently, he is working as a junior consultant to Demos Helsinki, a Finnish think tank, where he is developing a commons-based methodology for urban regeneration in heritage precincts. I would request Adityan to now begin with his presentation.
Thank you so much, Tushar, for having me here, and nice to see some familiar faces attending as well. So yes, good morning, everybody. I'm going to do a quick talk on the value of modern built heritage. I'm going to, like Tushar just mentioned, I was a project architect for the conservation and restoration of Le Corbusier's capital complex in Chandigarh. So I have first-hand experience of working with some modern heritage buildings. So we'll be looking at some of my experiences from there, as well as mostly what literature talks about in terms of what the value of modern built heritage could be, because I think it's still something that most people are wrapping their heads around. So to get that issue in everybody's mind, I'll start by just asking if anybody um, recognizes this building. Um, you can open your mic and tell me the first person who recognizes it. Nobody?
Yeah, I don't think we will be getting any audience participation.
Okay, that's
So,
fine.
Size will be large, then only the
just a second. Yeah, mute. Please continue.
Sorry, was somebody
No,
saying
no,
something?
I think
Okay, no,
somebody added
okay,
the
fine.
mic.
Fair enough, fair enough. Anyway, so the idea was I would just wanted to see if somebody would be able to recognize this building. Some people would, I mean, architects should ideally, but it would be perfectly understandable if somebody didn't. But this is the Schroeder House in Utrecht in the Netherlands. It was a house built in 1924 by two architects, Gerrit Rietveld and Truls Schroeder. Schroeder lived in it personally. But at first glance, you might not see. I mean, if you're not aware of the legacy of the house, at first glance, you might not, it might not really strike you that it's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. If you see this little plaque at the bottom left, it's actually a plaque saying that it was inscribed as a World Heritage Site in the year 2000. So, but when you do look at it, it's might not strike as a World Heritage Site. Why? So why was it inscribed as a World Heritage Site? Because I essentially the aesthetics and the design are the part of a modern Dutch movement, which is known as Destiel, or more in English, it would loosely translate to neoclassicism. It was started in 1917. So basically, what the movement was doing was searching for the purest abstraction of art, reducing all the elements to their basic forms and colors. So this building itself is considered as a sort of avant-garde construction during the time that it was built. And the intention was to sort of break free from the traditional construction systems of the time and open new horizons. So its facades, as you can see, it avoids any kinds of symmetry or play with it avoids any kind of symmetry or established order, and essentially it plays this role of just pure forms and basic colors, and the balconies kind of become planes that sort of glide past lines in these primary colors, creating sort of a collage. So that sort of a style is what the movement was about, and this is one of the foremost examples of that movement, and that's the reason. Apart from a lot of other reasons as well, why this was inscribed as a World Heritage Site. But if you if you do like a simple um, Google search, I did this yesterday night, with like a modern house in India, you see, you can clearly see that that sort of architecture, that sort of movement has had a lot of inspiration in even regular residential architecture that we might see in India, which a lot of architects sometimes might even argue is uninspired at this point because it's replicated so much. But what I'm trying to say is, for a non-architect, perhaps, who's seeing these sort of houses as they drive to work every day, in India, when you show them, and that's their idea of what the current modern architecture is, uh, and then when you show them this, do you think a common person would associate this building as a heritage? Would they? So that's the question that we're trying to answer today. Okay, so let's see. Okay, how could we then define modern heritage then? So UNESCO defines modern heritage as architecture, town planning, and landscape design of the 19th and 20th centuries. So pretty clear there. So these structures, they look at it more like as structures that are an icon of that period, and what defines them is this sort of rapid and unparalleled technological and socio-economic development that were driven by them. So it is hard to associate a modern building with heritage, but the problem is that it's hard to associate a modern building with heritage because heritage usually has connotations of old, dilapidated buildings, palaces, things like that, with considerable wear and tear, or made with different materials, such as maybe stone or brick. So firsthand, I think since a lot of people who are attending, we're from Delhi or we've lived in Delhi for a long time. So I think firsthand we've seen an issue of this sort of understanding of modern heritage in the case of the Hall of Nations in Pragati Maidan. So I guess it needs to no introduction, but um, the Hall of Nations was part of the Pragati Maidan, which is supposed to be, when it was designed and built, it was supposed to be sort of an insignia of the sovereign state. In fact, as we know, the architect was Raj Ragbol, and his masterpiece was built specifically to celebrate 25 years of the country's independence at that point of time. A feat that it managed by its very configuration. It showcased how India had grown post-independence, taking taking inspiration from the West, but not kowtowing to it, putting our own spin to it. Like with the delicacy of these intricate jalis, combined with the monumentality of the concrete structure. The Hall of Nations was designed as sort of a testament to our self-sufficiency, an icon of the aspirations of a country that we had established ourselves to be, which is a secular socialist nation. which relied on its technological and intellectual accomplishments to find its fate. But despite all of that, I think we know what happened uh, to the structure. So, um, if you read reports, um, you will read reports from the municipality. You will read that the Hall of Nations and the Hall of Industries have been demolished to make way for a state-of-the-art modern complex which would add immensely to the profile of the capital city. Um, okay, so why was it demolished despite a lot of opposition from architects, urbanists, historians, because they did associate it as an integral part of the city's identity and its heritage. So the issue here was that there is a heritage conservation committee set up in Delhi, which has the sort of say in which buildings need to be preserved and which do not need to be preserved. But the issue here was that when all the legislation started to be, or PIL started to be filed by architects, that we cannot demolish this structure when the new redevelopment plans came underway. Um, the plea went to the Heritage Conservation Committee and they had to make a decision. So while they were deciding, they had to answer to the Supreme Court. So they at one proceeding, they mentioned that, we cannot categorize this building as a heritage, it's on, because it's only 45 years old. And we need the buildings to be at least more than 70, 75 years old for us to classify it as heritage. So they sort of did not take responsibility for calling the building heritage. And what happened then? The, 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 the decision wasn't even made by the court. As soon as they provided that statement, the building was demolished overnight. And what people say why it was demolished overnight is because, well, when people will get to know, when the people who filed the litigation will get to know that the Heritage Conservation Committee said that they cannot call it heritage, of course, it makes way for it to be demolished. So people would come and there was a similar example when the little canopy, the little chhatri in front of India Gate was supposed to be demolished to put a statue of Mahatma Gandhi there. So at that point of time, students from SPA, I think, they just did like a dharna outside. They just sat there with with food and mugs of coffee, and then they sat there because they were worried that the chhatri might be demolished overnight when nobody's noticing them. So I think they were prepared, the municipality was prepared for a similar situation here, which is why they didn't waste any time and they demolished the structure overnight. So the problem is that when these sort of civic decisions are left to the judiciary, architectural conservation can easily fall prey to private prejudices and inconsistencies. Besides, major monuments like these all have historic associations. I mean, for example, this was built when the Congress was in power, and then it was demolished when another right-wing party was in power. So it basically falls on the political party in power to kind of decide the relevance of that historic association of the building. So these things cannot be left to be subjective like that. Anyway, moving forward, so the state of the art phrase, this is a photo of the new exhibition center that is to come up in place of the Hall of Nations. So this phrase is very popular amongst bureaucrats. State of the art. But the issue is if you actually look at it, the phrase translates as the quote the highest level of general development achieved at a particular time, unquote. So key word being here at a particular time. So Given the rate that technology races forward, today's state of the art is going to be old-fashioned in a few years. So we can't rely on that. But good architecture, that good architecture and design, that is timeless. So we can't really replace that with something that we might feel is state of the art today. So, okay, so let's see what exactly, if we ask the question, what exactly constitutes heritage, then, should heritage necessarily have an archaeological aspect to it? What exactly constitutes the architectural heritage of a city like Delhi, with a history that spans more than 2 millennia? You know, how do we classify heritage in a city like that? And the second question I ask is, must heritage necessarily have fulfilled a certain quota of posterity and antiquity before it can be termed as having cultural and social importance? And the third question I ask is, do buildings which do not come with some sort of attached sense of mystery or myth, do they not qualify for our reverence? So I'm going to move towards some of the key issues that exist in terms of understanding the value of modern heritage. The first one, I think, is just a lack of acknowledgement and protection, like in the case of the Hall of Nations or this photo. If nobody can guess, it's from inside the Civil Secretariat in Chandigarh. So basically, you're looking at a photo of a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is in use. And it's like a typical Sarkari office with archives piled to the roof. So if you go up and talk to any one of these people who are working there, and when I was going around doing drawings, making surveys, in the building, they would ask me, "Oh, okay, what are you doing now? Is something going to happen to the building?" And then like, "Yeah, we're gonna renovate it. We're gonna make it better." And then they ask me, "Okay, so what are you going to do?" So I tell them that, we're going to make it look like how it was originally, when the architect actually, how the architect actually intended it to be. And then they all, they give me a poker face. They're like, "Okay, why do you want to do that?" And I tell them, because it's a World Heritage Site. You're working in a World Heritage Site. And then their question would be, this building, this is heritage. This is not heritage. Why do you call it heritage? So I don't blame them. Like my example with the Shoda House, when you see these brutalist concrete buildings, you see them all the time around you. So for the uninitiated, it's understandable that there is a lack of acknowledgement that these kind of buildings could constitute heritage as well. And in continuation, because of a lack of acknowledgement, there is also a lack of protection, because when common people become bureaucrats and they are making the lawmakers, of course we cannot expect them to that sort of having that sort of understanding either. Then the second issue is that new and innovative construction methods and materials that typify the era, when it was built, challenge traditional conservation approaches and raise new methodological and philosophical issues. For example, again, in the case of the Capitol complex, if you see, this is a sketch from Corbusier for the skylight above the Punjab Assembly Hall. And as conservation architects, we try to retain the architect. It's very important, especially with modern heritage, to retain the technology that that was developed during that time to maintain the authenticity. But by today's standards, those technologies might be outdated, so you actually need to move back to the methods and materials that typified that period of time. And this sometimes, might raise issues with actually executing it, or also an ideological difference. For example, some conservation architects might say, "Oh, okay, so if we're going to restore a heritage building and we lose some part of it, like for example, we lose a column of it, then when we replicate the column, we need, some architects would say, we need to replicate it in a way that nobody can realize that it's a new one, so that it looks like the old one and it's authentic. But then there's also a school of thought which says that no, if we've lost the column, then it's lost. So when we replicate the column, we need to make sure that it looks different so that people know that this was added later and it isn't part of the original historic construction. So then the thing with buildings is that they distinguish themselves from artworks when it comes to conservation, simply because, for the most part, in order to survive, they have to be used. Again, a really good example is the Capitol complex in Chandigarh, because it constitutes the legislative assembly, the High Court, and the civil secretariat, which are actively used buildings with a lot of footfall every day, yet they are World Heritage Sites. But so the issue that comes with that sort of a situation is that in a lot of cases, since these buildings are in active use, in some cases, the building users and owners might feel that it might be better served if their buildings were less authentic but more comfortable and usable. For example, this is a photo of one of the courtrooms in the High Court. On the left side, it is how it was when Corbusier had designed it originally, and on the right is how it is right now. So, like you can probably see these all these additions that have happened over time. The layout has changed, and they've added these HVAC systems. They've cut the tapestries that Corbusier had designed to um, do the tapestries as well. And what's happening here is that, of course, when you move forward, you need more facilities in your system. You can't expect to, not have something like air conditioning when you move forward. But because you do some authenticity when you add things like that, and some things are not, some things might not be practical when you think of the conservation methodologies. Uh, so that's a dilemma that needs to be worked upon as well. And some more issues are that there's a repair versus a replacement debate. Some the lifespan and technical challenges exist in terms of durability and knowledge. Then there's the state of being obsolete, like the functionality, adaptability, sustainability. Then the assessment of the significance, like of this modern heritage, like I'm talking right now, is part of a process requiring some distance in time. Like today's buildings, of course, are will that important buildings will be heritage, but it's how do you decide the time span, after which you can actually call it heritage? For example, any Jar Ingles building or Norman Foster building that they're building right now should classify as an integral part of the city. But how do you decide what time span needs to be there? Then, a large part of our cities and our built environment are a direct or indirect result of this sort of modernity. So, like I mentioned, there's a tendency to overlook its importance, and emotional aspects, like a lot of architects like us might have with regards to buildings, might tend, and people who are not architects, their emotional aspects might tend to override sort of objective and critical analysis of what should be heritage and what shouldn't be. And one major issue I feel in a lot of cities is that modern heritage is often subsumed under urban development by cities instead of culture, and this often leads to a very narrow-minded perspective on the importance of those structures. For example, even in the case of the Hall of Nations, I mean, if the Urban Development Department decides that we need to redevelop Pragati Maidan and we need to demolish the building, it's sort of unfair because as a heritage structure, the Ministry of Culture should have a say in what needs to be done to the building as well. And then I would also say that in the case of modern heritage, more consideration should be given to the cultural processes rather than always taking a monumental approach. It's not always about a monument, it's not a heritage monument that we are talking about. Sometimes the processes are important as well. For example, again, I come back to Chandigarh, you know, uh, you know, Kubir's designed not just the capital complex, he designed the entire city. So, the whole urban ensemble, or the city pattern, I mean, the new engineering feats that he managed in, sculpts.
Because I guess we'll just wait uh, for Adityan to join back in. Sir, good morning. So the speaker had some, I think, connectivity issue, so he just got logged out, so he's just logging back in to the webinar.
He, I'm back. So sorry about that, everybody. I just had some issue with my system. So let's get back to what we were looking at. So, mhm, share screen. Uh, Tushar, is the screen fine? Do you see the slides
Yes,
again?
the screen is fine.
Okay, fine. So let's go on where we dropped off at. So yeah, so I was talking about the issues and sort of the criteria with which we need to take a look at modern heritage. So some other possible criteria possibly could be political and intellectual significance of the buildings, the cultural relevance, urban prominence. Some structures are just associated with cities. You can't expect a building to be under the ASI, for example, to actually have it associated with the importance of the city. And of course, international repute as well. Even in the case of the Hall of Nations, there there were international magazines and bodies of architects that actually wrote to the government to not raise the building just for redevelopment project. So, some architecture, of course, is of international repute as well. So we need to consider that in classifying it as heritage or not. Um, with some background working for UNESCO, I felt it's important to understand what UNESCO's role in this case would be as well. So there's these two bodies, ICOMOS, which is the International Council on Monuments and Sites, and DOCOMOMO, which is the Working Party for the Documentation and Conservation of Buildings, Sites, and Neighborhoods of the Modern Movement. So these are two bodies. They launched a joint program for the identification, documentation, and promotion of built heritage of the 19th and 20th centuries. It's called the Program on Modern Heritage. So UNESCO, as a body itself, is as actively acknowledged that modern heritage is an aspect that they need to look into. Unfortunately, even today, it's not aptly represented, as we will see in a bit. The program that they've designed, it basically focuses on raising awareness and concerning the heritage of architecture. A lot of it's just a lot of more heritage listings, so that modern architecture could its way onto the map and the UNESCO's World Heritage Site list as well. Because usually what's seen is that these structures are particularly vulnerable because of weak legal protection or low appreciation amongst the general public. So one very efficient way to make sure that sites get recognition and are protected is, of course, the UNESCO World Heritage Site tag, such as in the case of Corbusiers buildings in Chandigarh. Even though they're in bad shape and they're badly managed, uh, people, the Chandigarh administration cannot just decide to do what they want with it because it's a World Heritage Site. So there's a due process that needs to be gone through to make any changes to the buildings. Otherwise, they will lose that tag, which is not something they want to do because there's a lot of international attention and tourism and funding that comes with the World Heritage Site tag. How can we uh, how does a site become a World Heritage Site? So basically, the state party or India, basically they're allowed to send a nomination dossier every year to UNESCO for one of their sites, which can be inscribed as a World Heritage Site. And UNESCO selection criteria has basically 10 different types of criteria on which a building can be listed. So even if one of these criteria is sufficiently justified, for that particular building, then it is eligible to be declared a World Heritage Site. But out of these 10, in bold, the ones that I've bolded out are the ones that could very easily be put to modern heritage properties, such as criteria number one, which is to represent masterpiece of human creative genius. Okay, again, let's take the example of the Hall of Nations or the Capitol complex. They 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 designed, they fused modern architecture movements in the West and molded them into the Indian context to create something new, and not just in terms of design, but also in terms of structural design and engineering. Criteria number two, to exhibit an important interchange of human values over a span of time or within a cultural area of the world on developments in architecture and technology, monumental arts, town planning, or landscape design. Again, the interchange of the human values from different cultures as well. And like I mentioned, Corbusier also designed the whole city, so we also need to include things like town planning and landscape design. Criteria number three, to bear a unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or to a civilization which is living or which has disappeared. Criteria number four, to be an outstanding example of a building, architectural, or technological ensemble or landscape which illustrates significant stages in human history. Again, here I think it's important to understand that they all talk about architectural, technological ensembles as well, and landscape. So they're not necessarily looking at isolated buildings. Then criteria number 6, which is to be directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, ideas, or with beliefs, with artistic and literary works of outstanding universal significance. So this is one criteria that usually doesn't work just by itself. You need to associate it with one of the other criteria on the list. But anyway, my point here was to say that with, when you need only one of these criteria to declare a world site, a World Heritage Site, it's not impossible to have modern heritage sites on that list, which is the case over time. For example, when the first listing that they did as of July 2002, these were the modern heritage sites that were World Heritage Sites declared by UNESCO. There were 12 of them, but in 2000 and I think it was 2006 or 2007 in Chandigarh, there was a workshop by the UNESCO where they acknowledged the fact that modern heritage was not sufficiently represented in the World Heritage listing. And this is a quote from the proceedings of that conference, where they say that with only 12 properties out of the total 730, only 12 relate to modern heritage. So, it wasn't sufficiently represented. And even after 4 more years, um, it it doubled, but it was only 24 as of 2006. And this is the last listing that they have on their website. Unfortunately, after 2006, they haven't seemed to have compiled the other modern heritage sites that have been added here. But in this list, maybe you will recognize a lot of these buildings. I mean, we learned them during architecture school as well. And there's also our own Victoria Terminus from Mumbai in this list as well. But I took it on me personally to find some of the modern heritage properties that were added on the list after 2006. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if this is all of them, but this some of the most important ones, especially the ones on the right, which is the architectural work of Le Corbusier. It was a transnational nomination, meaning that one country didn't submit this dossier. It was submitted by a consortium of multiple countries, because Corbusier had structures in a lot of countries. So all of the countries came together to submit it as one consolidated heritage site nomination, including India, which is how the Capitol complex in Chandigarh got inscribed a World Heritage Site. And then the most recent one was only declared a World Heritage Site in 2020, which is the Victorian and Gothic, or 2019, which is the Victorian, Gothic, and Art Deco ensembles of Mumbai, which was a dossier that I had worked on during my tenure with Urban and Lamba. So moving on to some of the needs I feel in terms of appreciating modern heritage. So, you know, there's an issue in leadership, strategic research, um, uh, and even with the industry, when we have conservation projects such as that of the Capitol complex, and you have these one huge issue that the Chandigarh administration was having with that project is that we made the conservation plan for it. We floated tenders to have contractors come in to restore the structures, but I think it was for the civil secretariat that they had to float the tenders. As far as when I was working, they had to float the tenders over 5 times over 1 year, and yet they had no bidders at all, which is very uncanny. And even after each flotation of the tender, we broaden the scope of work and the selection criteria for the bidders as well. But yet, no, there were no takers for it. I mean, it could be bias. It could be because they're not sure of the appropriate repair techniques when we talk about concrete repair and things like that. Of course, there are technologies, but it might not be something that most conservation-focused companies in India, for example, have worked with. It might be something more modern companies have worked with, modern contractors have worked with, but then modern contractors might not have the specialized expertise to do conservation per se. Then there's issues where these assessments of iconic architectural buildings might be seen as something very elite. It's an elitist ideology, and some prominent architects in academia, they sit and say that some buildings should be conserved as modern heritage. But what about the common people? If they're not understanding the value of these buildings, then it's lost. So, there should be a move to more of a community-based heritage assessments, such as in the case of the Victorian and Art Deco ensemble of Mumbai, where it was the people of Mumbai who were using those spaces on a daily basis, and they had a sort of responsibility towards the heritage that they had inherited. So they were responsible on bringing it to the World Heritage Map. So more community-based heritage assessment is important as well. And there is research that is needed to develop technical solutions for, like I mentioned earlier, such as the repair of exposed concrete, cladding systems, plastics, on more research on the modern materials and how they deteriorate. And, that's also difficult. Like if it's a material that was used 50 years back, maybe it's not enough time to study how that material is deteriorating. So we need the time span there as well. Then, of course, I think the most important part is the need to focus on good solutions by publicizing conferences, publications, more education, and regarding the successful projects, successful restoration and adaptive reuse projects as well. Then very quickly, this was just something interesting that I found during my research, that there's an international standard by ICOMOS, specifically oriented towards late 20th century places. And it's known as the Approaches for the Conservation of 20th Century Heritage, or the Madrid New Delhi document, because it was endorsed by during the ICOMOS General Assembly in New Delhi in 2017. So I'm not going to go through the standards. There's a link on the ICOMOS website where if you're interested in conservation of such modern heritage, you can look into it. But it basically lists down 5 specific approaches that you have on the screen right now, with a lot of sub subheadings under each one of them, which might range from very simple things like making a more established heritage identification and assessment criteria, to something more even more broad, like establish limits of acceptable change of a heritage building. How much change can it go, because most of these are in active use. They're not museums, they're not exhibition halls, they're offices or residences, or public spaces that are being used. So they have had change over time. So how much change is actually good for the building or not? So they've listed down these criteria. So this is an important document for architects and conservationists who are working with modern heritage. Then towards closing, the future of modern heritage, in my opinion, and something I read in literature, is that we like I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a significant time period for people to actually understand the significance of a structure and actually be able to call it heritage, and more so in the case of modern heritage. So, with time, and with this sort of community and collective appreciation of these structures, there will be abundance and diversity in modern heritage. And some might be lost, but if we increase public interest, then we might help people understand. But that's the core of it all. We need the common citizens to be able to understand the importance of these structures, even if they're not associated with traditionally heritage buildings. And then at the same time, I would also say that we should also consider changing the culture of conservation for sub-iconic buildings. I mean, a lot of the buildings that might not have been necessarily designed by prominent architects during that period, but they use these innovative techniques and materials from that period of time, and that is reason enough to need to preserve them, especially in the current scenario with the climate emergency, because you know conservation and restoration, although in a lot of cases it might be it's more expensive, it's a very expensive affair, but if you consider all the embodied energy and all the carbon emissions that come from construction industry being almost 30% of the contributor to the carbon footprint from industries. So it's always a good idea to consider preserving even these sub iconic structures rather than demolishing them or creating new structures. So that's also a debate that we need to have. So in closing, I'd again show a really sad picture of the Hall of Nations being demolished, and and a quote from Narayani Gupta, which says that a truly world-class city is not one that destroys to build, but one where different icons from different pasts live together happily. So different icons from different pasts, not necessarily uh, Mughals or sultanates or kingdoms, but also different parts from our history, post-independence, or it could be even a little section of our history, for example, um, protests or significant political movements or activities that might have happened in our city. So the built environment surrounding those activities and movements are also a part of our past. So a truly world-class city would appreciate all those different parts. And yes, that's where I will close.
Thank you, Adityan. I think it was a very comprehensively put together presentation. So I do see quite a few known faces in the participant list, so I hope we can have a discussion. But before that, I would like to welcome architect Premendra Raj Mehta, who is the mentor of the school. Good morning, sir. And I'm also very happy to welcome architect Manoj Jain, who is also a faculty at the school, and I welcome him as well. So good morning to both of you. So if either of you has any
Yes,
views or
yes,
comments on the
I
topic
would like to
itself.
say something.
Yes, sir, please go
I
ahead.
think I must compliment Adityan. I think you made a very interesting case for retaining iconic buildings, whatever era, whatever they are, whichever part of the world, whatever character they have, whatever they speak about. But I think it is a very well presented a case, and I think we need to document it and make a representation, at least in India, with our government, that here is a case. So what I would request is that if you could summarize it, Adityan, put illustrations together, and I think we at Periyar School would take it forward and make it a point with the government and the respective governments, because these kind of things are dealt with the central government as well as state government, urban development department. India is so diverse and we have diverse situations, so why not? So I think we will take it forward. That's the only thing I can say. And I once again compliment him for a very comprehensive presentation on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And Manoj sir, if you would also, if you have any comments or views on the topic itself. Or in the meantime, we also open the floor for participant questions. So if there are any comments or questions from the participants themselves, then please feel free to go ahead. You can either put them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself and ask the question, whichever is you're more comfortable. Manoj, sir, yeah, please.
Yeah, Tushar.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Tushar. Yeah. Hi.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah, it's very informative and nice webinar by Mr. Adityan. And certainly, I joined late, but it was, whatever I could gather, it was really a very nice presentation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I think to get the discussion started, I have one very crude question to probably get it off the right. So let's say, for example, if you take the example of these 19th and 20th century buildings, do you think there's this need for making them into sort of because if you go by the natural progression of time, right? So the older buildings that are still surviving and have become iconic are sort of in a way automatically considered heritage in a way, even if they are not recognized or something. So the question comes about the modern building. So maybe if we let the natural progression flow, then over time the 18th and or the 19th and 20th century buildings might also become heritage buildings, let's say 2 centuries down the line, right? So my question to you is the need for considering modern heritage also because the shelf life, if we can call it, of the buildings nowadays is shorter or much shorter than what we would, let's say, consider 2 centuries or 3 centuries earlier?
Yeah, I think that definitely factors in this case, because even like if you think of modern heritage and primarily concrete buildings, of course, then yes, there I think we can't wait for 200 years to call them heritage because their lifespan itself might only be half of that, or maybe not even half of that. Even for example, in terms of Corbusier's buildings, it's not even been 80 years, but they show significant issues when it comes to maintenance, and of course, I think that's also another pressing reason why there needs to be an active push towards at least even it doesn't need to be UNESCO recognizing it, or international, but every city usually has their own local heritage listing and their own regulations. I think the basic thing that needs to be done is at least revising those procedures and having those basic listings done, so that at least on some document there is this acknowledgement that these structures are not to be put through any sort of a negative development. And then, of course, then there's aspects of actually the funding behind the restoration of these projects, which is another debate altogether. But yes, I think with modern buildings and even contemporary buildings, if we talk about the buildings the last 20 years, that we cannot assume that their lifespan is going to be as much as the traditional heritage buildings. So we need to keep that aspect in mind when we try to classify as these buildings as heritage. So we need to be more flexible to consider even structures that are 20, 25 years old if they've had enough cultural impact on cities and countries and people, then that should be assessment enough to be able to classify them as heritage. For example, in Finland, Finland doesn't have a lot of architectural heritage per se because they were a poor country before independence, and mostly they're a timber-rich country, so they had mostly timber structures. When you know what happens with timber structures, they burn down. Somebody lights a candle somewhere. So they don't have significant modern or historic buildings there, but they try to consider even like typical family houses that were built 35 years back as sort of heritage, which might be quite appalling for Indians like us because we have such richness when it comes to cultural heritage that we might not be able to easily see as something like, oh, some house that was made by some prominent architect, 5 years after the country's independence or 20 years back is something of heritage significance. But they do, and I think that's how it needs to go forward. Because, like I also mentioned towards the end, it's not just about preserving iconic architecture. Sometimes, uh, with with it's just more climate friendly sometimes to preserve buildings as well. The greenest, like they say, the greenest building is the one that you do not build, but we cannot always not build. So, the next best thing is to use the one you already have built.
Okay. Thank you for the answer. Is there any participant who wants to ask a question? I think we do have time for one last question. You can either put it in the chat box or you can just unmute yourself, ask. Uh, okay. So I don't think we have a question from there, but in that case, I think to wrap up the discussion, I would probably have one last sort of point that I would want your comments on. And I think with that, we can probably wrap up the webinar after that. So is this a question of, for example, let's say when we talk about conservation and preservation, so you talked about the degree of change, right, or the amount of change that is possible or that is allowed. So do you think in a way maybe conservation is also a deterrent to change? In, for example, let's take the example of, let's say, a residential building. Like, for example, if in Finland there's a 35-year-old residential that is now considered as heritage, but let's say the residents themselves want a change, right? So, so how do you address that sort of of a tug of war between like the want for change and the want for heritage preservation?
Yeah, that's an issue that owners of buildings face all the time. I think more prominently so when it comes to, I mean, of course, even in India as well. But I think that since the regulations are a little bit more strict here in Europe, in the city centers, it's usually just houses, apartments that people actively live in, which are heritage structures, and then the people are imposed upon by the government to actually maintain those buildings, and it's not cheap at all. In most cases, the people who own the buildings cannot afford uh, conserving things that were built so back in stone and masonry. Issues in Finland, where there's a lot of issue with mold, for example, and usually it's of course the old buildings that need that sort of maintenance much more frequently, often even once a year. Um, so, okay, not just maintenance, but like you mentioned, if sometimes people want the change, but that sort of falls upon how we do it here in Finland is that, or in most countries, I think it's that the regulations usually apply for those sort of buildings only from the building shell and the facades. So there needs to be a certain amount of regulation when it comes to preserving them. But if the residents themselves um, whatever changes they want inside the buildings because it's their own personal space, then in that case, they're free to do whatever they want. The case is a bit different when it comes to public buildings, of course, because it's not only on the residents how it needs to be used. It's accessed by everybody. So in that case, for example, even in the case of the Capitol complex, for example, the conservation was restricted more to or prioritized more towards the common spaces. For example, we would, of course, do the facades, and in the interiors, we would do the lobbies, the corridors, some of the more iconic spaces like the assembly halls themselves, which had more of a concrete vision. But the secretariat has like over 500 offices. If we're going to do each office as the way Caprice is going to do, one, it's impractical, and two, the end users, which are the staff that's working there, they gain no benefit from it. In which case, of course, what we did was that give just certain guidelines, like, okay, this is the kind of things you can have if you want it to be authentic, but it's not mandatory for them. So the rules only apply more to the common spaces, which individual people might not necessarily need to have a say in how those need to look and perform, and the facades. So I think that's where a level of flexibility comes in, depending on who owns it and what the use of the spaces are.
Okay. Yeah, thank you again for the answer. And I think with this, we can bring the webinar to a close. It was, I think, a wonderfully presented and a wonderfully put together presentation. And as said, I think I look forward to the summarized version of it so that both you and us as a school can take it up to the relevant authorities and bring in the requisite changes. So yeah, I think I thank Adityan as well as all the participants for making time and for attending the webinar today. With this, I bring the webinar to a close. Please have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.